Good afternoon. We're so pleased that you're joining us this afternoon for this Sundays at Home program. On this Super Bowl alternative Sunday, Dr. Bonnie J. Morris will be in conversation with writers Lyndsey D'Arcangelo and Brittany De La Crata, co-authors of the recently released Hail Mary, The Rise and Fall of the National Women's Football League. My name is Lori Ann Turchison, and I serve as the Director of Education at the National Women's History Museum. For those of you who are with us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have attended a Sundays at Home program before, welcome back, and thank you again for your continued support. We thank you for taking your time out of your Sunday to be with us this afternoon. And I'm joined today by NWHM Scholars Advisory Council member, Dr. Bonnie Morris. Bonnie earned her PhD in Women's History from, I always say this wrong, so I have to slow down, from Binghamton University, and taught at both George Washington University and Georgetown for almost 25 years. Becoming Professor Emeritus and Professor of the Year at GWU and Bicentennial Medalist at Georgetown. In 2017, she joined the history faculty at the University of California, Berkeley, earning a nomination for its Excellence in Teaching Prize, a nationally recognized authority on the women's music movement and women's sports history. Dr. Morris is the author of 19 books, including the forthcoming women's sports retrospective, What's the Score, in June. I've already pre-ordered it. I hope you do the same. Bonnie is a regularly featured speaker at national conferences and on C-SPAN, and you can learn more about her work at www.bonniejmorris.com. Lyndsey D'Arcangelo writes about women's college basketball and the WNBA for The Athletic and Just Women's Sports. Her articles, columns, and profiles on female and LGBTQ+ athletes have previously appeared in The Ringer, Deadspin, ESPNW, and ESPN, Teen Vogue, The Buffalo News, The Huffington Post, NBC Out, and more. She received a notable mention in the 2018 Best American Sports Writing Anthology for her story, My Father, Trump, and the Buffalo Bills. Lyndsey has previously published 3 young adult LGBTQ+ books, one of which won a Golden Crown Literary Society Award for debut author. She currently lives in Buffalo, New York, and you can learn more about her work at www.lyndseydarcangelo.com. And Brittany, I'm sorry, I think I've said your name wrong already. Brittany De La Crata, hope I got it right that time, as if she tried to teach me beforehand, is a freelance writer whose work sits at the intersection of sports, gender, culture, and queerness. Their writing is a mix between reported journalism and creative nonfiction, and they teach writing classes at Grub Street. They are the former sports columnist for Long Reads, as well as the former sports and culture columnist for Bitch Media. Their work has been featured in the New York Times, Sports Illustrated, Vogue, The Washington Post, Teen Vogue, Bleacher Report, The Ringer, The Atlantic, ESPNW, Elle, Marie Claire, and many others. You can learn more about Brittany's work at www.britnydlc.com. We're grateful to have all 3 panelists with us today to guide our conversation. Thank you again for joining us. Before I turn the program over to our moderator, allow me to go over a few housekeeping items. As always, this presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the days following the event. Our panelists will answer your questions after our conversation, so please use the chat feature you see on the toolbar there at the bottom of your screen for any comments that you have during the program, and use the Q&A feature, again, there at the bottom of your screen, to ask any questions that you may have for the panelists. You may ask your questions at any time during the presentation, but they won't be answered until the end of the presentation. Now, please join me in welcoming Bonnie, Lyndsey, and Brittany to the screen.
Hello. It is a pleasure to be here as part of my ongoing work with the National Women's History Museum. I'm Bonnie Morris. I've taught women's sports history for almost 25 years, and even I was relatively unfamiliar with the fascinating story uncovered by our guests. These stellar journalists, both of whom write about gender and culture in American women's sports, have collaborated on a new book that really offers one of the first thorough histories of the National Women's Football League, a dynamic roster of teams competing across 19 cities in the shifting Title IX landscape of the 1970s. So here on Super Bowl Sunday, we're going to look into their research on 2 decades of record-breaking teams, rivalries, and the very sexist pushback to women's sports history. Why don't we know about these teams? When did we begin to learn about them? What can we learn from them? There's so much to ask, but I'm going to let the authors speak. And the first really fun question I want to put out there is, what was it like to research and write the book, uncovering so much and writing so well as a team?
What do you think, Lindsay? I think it was fun. I don't know, but like, so when we were in the research process, the way we did this is there's so much to cover. So we split the teams in half and we each kind of went off in our own direction. But what's really fun is that when you uncover something, you have someone that's equally as excited as you are. So every time we had a new piece of information or we tracked down a player that we'd been looking for, or whatever it is, like you have someone to share that with, who's not just like, you know, your friends or your partners who are like, that's cool. You know, like Lindsay was equally as excited and like would nerd out with me and vice versa. So I think that was something that was nice about getting to do this with somebody else.
Yeah, it was definitely, I mean, we did a lot of our research came from old newspaper clippings, where we were able to discover more about the teams and then get player names, where then we could write those names down and then contact the players after the fact and get more information from them. But anytime one of us would come across an article that was, you know, just kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe they used this headline or wrote about the players in a certain way, or just with some sort of tidbit information that was just so like amazing, we'd share it with each other. And it was, I'd say the research process itself didn't feel like as heavy of a load as it really was, because we were so engrossed in the topic and just uncovering the story and wanting to get it out there.
I think that women's collaboration within Project Uncovering History is just as compelling a story. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask, you're very clear right at the introduction that regrettably in women's sports, what we find is this ongoing problem. I'm going to quote from page 4. In the press, the players' looks were always described before their playing abilities. They always had to talk about what their male partners thought about their affinity for this contact sport. And so while you're uncovering journalistic tributes to these winning teams, you're also uncovering the kind of insulting questions or limited questions the players are asked. Did you notice any patterns in how nervous journalists approach female football players?
Oh yeah, I think the majority, the majority of the articles and columns and that were written about these women at this time were, you know, satirical in nature, or just really coming at it from a, you know, sort of I can't believe what these women are doing kind of a thing, or they focused on, you know, the uniforms these women wore, like how they protected their physical bodies, their breast in particular. There was they clung to the idea of that all these women were rabid feminists. That was another often highly written about topic. Very few were generally written about the players as football players and the teams and what they were doing. Those, we mentioned a few in the book that stood out to us that were quality articles and really dug into why these women were playing and the accomplishments that they were, you know, achieving at this time. But most of what we discovered was, you know, appalling. Really, a lot of it was appalling.
Yeah. And I think you have to think about, you know, the history that we know and the stories we were told about people are viewed through the lens of the people who are writing them. And at this time, it's mostly men. And so they were pretty good at getting the stats right and the play-by-play. So like our game recreations where we have them are probably pretty accurate, but less reliable is the stuff where you actually talk to the players themselves. We had some players who were like, I never said any of that, but we needed the press, so I didn't push back. And so then it creates like an unreliable narrative in your source documents, which is a really interesting problem to have. And you start to ask what is accurate. But then the other problem is that what the quotes that you do have, like Lindsay says, they are only being asked these very specific questions. And so the questions are being framed through the lens of the person who's, doing the reporting. And so when everyone is being asked, what does your, presumed male partner think of you playing this? And are you a women's libber? And those are the only questions they're being asked. Those are the answers that we have. And so those are the things that come up repeatedly. And it's just because they're not being given the opportunity to like talk about what it was like for them.
Okay, so this is a history of a successful National Women's Football League. These were terrific athletes. They were amazing games. There are intense rivalries. The women have their lives changed. They sustain friendships, injuries, the predicament of explaining themselves to the press. And I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about what the book tells us as quickly as you can. But I'd like to draw our listeners' attention to a wonderful point you make on page 222. Everybody read the whole damn book, where you say, in much of the Midwest, there's already a culture of interest in football. That helped. And where you have an interest in football, despite suspicion, there's going to be interest in women playing football because it's football. And so as much as there's this climate of sexism and homophobia, there's a culture of football. And you're writing about that with women in it. So what's the main thrust of the book?
Yeah, I think when we look at where these teams existed, it's largely in the Rust Belt region, and states like Ohio and Michigan is kind of where the teams that kept popping up over and over and over again happen. And part of the reason we can look at Ohio specifically is, football itself was born in Ohio, and the Football Hall of Fame, the Pro Football Hall of Fame is in Ohio. The NFL, is in Ohio. Ohio State football is there. There is this culture of football. And we see, up until this time, women have been excluded from many organized sporting opportunities. And as Title IX is passing and there's more opportunities for women to play, they're getting more access, but not necessarily access to football. And so they were shut out of the thing that like the culture centers around. Like game day culture is like a holy day. People plan their Sundays around watching the game, and it's something that women have been historically excluded from. So when the opportunity presented it to them, of course they wanted to play, because just because they're women like didn't mean that they also weren't immersed in the football culture too.
Lyndsey, do you want to add to that?
No, that's all in Brittany's wheelhouse. Like when Brittany says we split up the teams, we also split up certain parts of the book, and Brittany really did an amazing job driving into the Rust Belt culture and why football took such a hold around that particular area. So there's nothing more I need to add to that.
Well, it strikes me because I've looked at the history of the All-American Girls Baseball League, which also was originated in the Midwest for a variety of reasons. But there's actually a lot of small town pride and support and interest in whatever innovations there are for local entertainment that's affordable and dynamic and tough. And you have all of those qualities, in particular in times of fluctuating employment and various other aspects that would draw people to go to an event where they can watch their hometown people. And but you're making a really important point, Brittany, which is as much as there's reluctance in the 70s in kicking open the door for women in sports through top-down law of Title IX in schools, football is often referred to as a third sex. There was an effort in Title IX to exempt football right away, that the football budget should never be cut in a school that was opening up funding for women. A lot of people don't realize when we talk about Title IX law, even now, once you're out of school, it does not apply to you. It does not cover any kind of professional league. It certainly doesn't cover, the Olympics. It's for American schools, and it's only for American schools that take federal funding. If you're a religious school, you can say no to federal funding and discriminate in every sport. So really, to open up football for women and girls in schools is one of the hardest barriers. And do you think that by promoting this backstory in your book, you're going to help today's young women who want to play football in school?
Well, I think it's already happening. Girls are playing youth football at a higher clip now. I know we mentioned some of the stats in the books. I don't recall specifically right at this moment, but it's definitely has increased, especially in the past, I want to say 5 to 10 years, it's really gone up. But also there's this recent, I think it was last year in 2020, that NFL, partnered to bring flag football to high schools and around the country. So that program is now being developed where girls are being introduced to the game at a younger age. I mean, there was always this disconnect, and you saw this with the National Women's Football League. The women who played in this league, yes, they played, in backyards and with their brothers and friends and stuff, but they never got to play youth football. They never got to play in middle school or high school. So when they were starting to play as adults and from 18, the age range from 18 to 40 years old, they were just learning the fundamentals at those ages. Like, they didn't have that background to build on. There was no pipeline for that. And that's something, if we want to cultivate, a space for young girls and women to play football in whatever capacity, whether it's tackle or flag, which is a lot safer, they will have that sort of pipeline to grow with the game, which did not exist back then. So that's something I think we're seeing that has changed. It was, you obviously see that, and when we talk about it in the book, that was lacking. But also, a lot of people don't realize that women have been trying to play this game since it was invented. And we recount many instances throughout the book, throughout the history chapters, where, women either did it against, against people who told them they couldn't, or an opportunity arose just because there weren't enough boys to field a team. So a bunch of girls got together and formed a team at a school, different incidents like that. And always, there was always resistance, or it was like a one-time thing. So I think that's one of the important aspects of the story that I don't want to get lost, is for people to realize that women have been trying to play football and told they couldn't in some shape or form since the sport was invented.
The history is incredible. I mean, the book is a historian's dream. And you also make a wonderful thematic point, I think, that this isn't necessarily the story of women trying to play football with men, or their whole point was integrating, if you will, the teams everywhere. The book is about the pride women had in having their own league.
Oh, yeah.
That they were very clear, and they often said so to reporters if they had the chance, that this was about their league and their teams, and that's very significant. And did that make it less of a threat, or even more hard to fathom for some critics?
I think I will say, and Lynn, feel free to add something or disagree, but I think it made it less threatening in some ways, because I think that, football is one of the most, if not the most, masculine coded sports that we have. And the idea that women could or would want to play it is we still see people think that wouldn't be true. And so part of why a lot of the press and fans showed up in the beginning was because they didn't believe that women could be any good at football, and they wanted to mock them or make fun of them, or see oh yeah, they're not any good. And so I do think in some ways that did make it less of a threat. And then, but at the same time, what's being threatened is not so much the sport of football itself. What's being threatened is societal norms and ideas about what women should and shouldn't do. And so that's where the women don't belong on the field. They're just a bunch of women's libbers. We don't have to listen to them. And the women are trying to be like, we just want to play football, to downplay how threatening they are to right the status quo. So it's not the sport that's being threatened. It's the status quo and the idea of like gender roles and where women do and don't belong.
Yeah, I was going to say both, because even to this day, men are still threatened by women getting involved in sports, whether it's through fandom, whether it's through participation, whether it's through becoming a commentator or an analyst, especially in football. I mean, we just had an incident not too long ago with Mina Kimes, who's an NFL analyst on ESPN, who was called out by a former football player specifically because he was saying, how could she know the game? She has never thrown a pass, she's never played. Well, there's a lot of nuance to that, because she never had an opportunity to play or, participate, number one. And number two, how many male analysts have never played football and are still able to do what they do and learn the game and speak on it intelligently? So even that's just one example that to this day, men by and large are still somewhat threatened by women participating and wanting to, what they see, I guess, as an invasion of their space. Sports, I just want to say this, because this has always been my thing. When sports by and large are not gender specific. It has never been gender specific. Sports are sports, they just exist for people, human beings, to participate in,
Well, I love to joke with my students that we take any person and for girls, we forbid basic human functions. You're not supposed to sweat. You're not supposed to belch. You're not supposed to show any of that when you're competing as an athlete, whereas men are permitted. And you're right. The idea that authority is scary. Last year, I believe, is the first Super Bowl where there was a woman official, knowledge about the game, or being strong. Those are two different things, but those are the two threatening things that we see throughout women's history. And ironically, again, in the regions you're describing, the Midwest, there's no problem with women being strong, farm women, having enormous upper body strength from carrying buckets of milk, working on a farm, carrying the twins around while you're churning butter, whatever, historically. As long as it's family directed, you can be strong, but you're not supposed to channel strength into the pleasure of athletic competition.
Yeah. One thing I want to I add about the Super Bowl last year that had the woman, Sarah Thomas officiating and, women coaching on the sidelines is we believe we make a direct tie to those women and to the NWFL. When the team started, they were all coached by men, and a reporter asked one of them, why are there no women coaching? And the answer to that was because they're not given the opportunity to learn the fundamentals, and therefore they can't coach. But what we see as the league progresses is former players move and they shift into coaching roles. We believe the first women to ever coach pro football coached in the NWFL. And it was because they were given access to be able to play and learn those fundamentals that they could then teach them to other women. And the women that coach today largely come out of the semi-pro leagues that currently exist, which stand on the shoulders of the NWFL. And you can see this direct line from this league to the 12 women who coach in the NFL today, and Sarah Thomas, who's officiating, and all of the women who are involved. And it's once you give access because that's what it is. It's not that there's a talent differential. It's that there's an access differential, an investment differential.
And then that brings in the mother-daughter connection, because culturally, we just don't see those, commercials where you have a father and son throwing the football around, and that's, quality parent-child time. We need to see now more experienced moms showing their daughters the fundamentals in a halftime commercial or, an ad about family life. I think that's a visual that really startles people. But that's the next obvious result of this generational pipeline. I wanted to ask, there's another problem that you raise in the book, which is that local stadium histories and even Wikipedia don't list these records of women's teams, these victories, these games. They don't include the highlights. And so what are some of the attitudes or circumstances that bury this very terrific local and national history? How do we correct that?
I mean, hopefully we correct it with books like this. The NWFL has a Wikipedia page now because of our book. Hopefully people will keep filling it out. But when we started this project, the NWFL didn't even have a Wikipedia page. And some of these teams, if you read the book, you'll see the Dallas Bluebonnets played in Texas Stadium, which is where the Dallas Cowboys played. So let's be like super clear about, they're not, some of the teams played at some high school stadiums and some, like the Bluebonnets, were literally playing in NFL stadiums. And maybe it's changed. I haven't checked since our book came out, but if you go to the Wikipedia page for Texas Stadium, and the Dallas Bluebonnets, a pro team, are not listed there. And that was, repeated for Taft Stadium, where the Oklahoma City Dolls played. That was changed while we were reporting the book. When I started, it wasn't there. And by the time we finished, it had been added. I don't know why, but I think people, writing books like this and talking about it is how we start to change it. But, Linz, do you have any thoughts on like the attitudes that bury it?
Well, I think we ran up against this when we were doing our research, is that one of the reasons why we had to resort to a lot of newspaper clippings initially before we ended up talking to players, and then they would supply us with memorabilia and programs and things of that nature, was that the NWFL did not keep good stats. They were disorganized with that. So there's not a lot of stats that we can, or even records that we could share and talk about and discuss, as you do with a lot of sports leagues and in sports circles. But so I think that was part of the problem. And also, as the league initially started, the media frenzy was, there was a lot of initial interest there. It was a novelty. It was something that, oh my God, these women are playing football, kind of a thing. And then there was genuine curiosity. So there were a lot more articles in the first few years and then during its heyday. But as the league went on, it started to dissipate, and we had a lot harder time finding any information and articles about the league in its later years. So I think, and Brittany has raised this before, it's just, if it's not written about, did it even happen? Did it exist? So it's one of those things that's going on. And again, like with this book, we're hoping to rectify that and hope that more coverage will come, more information will come out after this. We just wanted to kind of open the floodgates a bit and get these women the attention and recognition they deserve. And then hopefully more of that information will come out, more players will come forward and share their stories, and it'll just, take off on its own. But those were some of the things I think that impact that.
I think for a lot of women's organizations, before there's digital media, recovering information is much harder. And a note to women's organizations, keep good records from the onset. But is there like a material legacy from this era? Football jerseys, did they have trading cards? Did they sign photographs of themselves? Do we have anything like that?
That was part of the problem too, with the league itself, and just being sort of new at this and not really going all in on the marketing and promotion. There was a lot of that the players had to do themselves and create themselves. It wasn't something that was done by the league heads or the team owners. I think the Toledo Troopers were probably the best at it, and Brittany can speak more of that because they covered them. But yeah, there was a real lack of capitalization on marketing and stuff like trading cards. You would think that would be such an asset to get fans familiar with the players, but they just weren't able to think outside the box in that way.
They didn't have the money. Like when we talk about they were selling raffle tickets. The players were making $25 a game, and most of them stopped seeing that after the first few games, if not the first season. There just was really no money. I know there are some like I found though my first connection to the Oklahoma City Dolls was because the niece of the quarterback, Jan Hines, her niece is now a sports writer in Oklahoma, and she tweeted a picture of a Dolls t-shirt that had belonged to her aunt. And I was like, all on her Twitter mentions, like, hi, can we talk? So like those things exist. I know when our book came out, a bunch of people who, you know, are football history collectors and went looking on eBay to see if any memorabilia exists. If anyone finds any, let us know. But there's very few. There's, you know, I have the women's sports issue of Women's Sports Magazine, which was Billie Jean King's sports magazine, that had Linda Jefferson on the cover. I went and bought it off eBay because it was it's how I discovered the league in the first place. But you have to like go looking for that, and very little exists. And I think it really is because there was no money for any of it. So the players have, a lot of them have their jerseys in their closets, you know, and we have, each of us, I think, have collected a number of game programs at this point, but they've been handed to us by players.
I'm, you know, raising this in part because in some future time, we do hope with the National Women's History Museum to do an exhibit on women's sports. And this is just a delectable thought of having a jersey or, you know, a game program. These are all, yes, collector's items, but they're also proof. They're part of the Scooby-Doo mystery, you know, trail of uncovering all of this. I'd like to switch briefly to another, I think, important question. People are attracted to these games in part. I think, Lyndsey, you said it's a novelty. Can these women really play? Can they play rough sports as men do? And then that rolls over into should they? And people worrying about women getting hurt. Let's talk about the reaction to women enjoying rough sports and the public's reluctance to see women get hurt, and how that in the 70s, getting used to women doing rough sports comes up against growing awareness of intimate violence. So when people see a woman with a black eye or a broken nose, their first thought is, you know, relationship abuse. And getting used to seeing women with athletic injuries, taken a while. We know women can recover and no pain, no gain, but there's a social reaction to women's bruising that's an interesting part of 70s feminism. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
It's really interesting. What I will say is that the idea that women shouldn't really play sports competitively, it was pretty much always available recreationally to some degree. But particularly competitively, you know, goes back to Victorian times. And a lot of that concern is rooted in these like paternalistic ideas about women needed to be protected. Women, you know, they need to be protected from themselves, from their own impulses, from injury. This again goes back to that women's bodies' primary objective is to reproduce. And if they get injured playing sports, they could, I don't know, they could get hit on the breast and get breast cancer. Their uterus could fall out. They would not be able to fulfill their societal, you know, duty to reproduce. And we see that paternalistic idea come up over and over again. And that has shifted over time. And I think that something interesting that comes up when we talk specifically about football and what we know about brain injury risk and injury risk and like these really real safety issues that are being raised for everyone that plays the sport, including people, you know, in the NFL players, right? I think there's this really, there's this line that comes up between like what is this paternalistic desire to protect women from injury and think that they can't do this because they're women, and where is the letting women take informed risk with their bodies, knowing what they are subjecting themselves to and making decisions like for their own bodily autonomy. And those are things I think that we see coming up a lot. I don't know that we came upon, Lynn, did you come upon any of this about, you know, the narrative around sports injuries and intimate partner violence?
No, actually, that would be another great wrinkle to explore in regards to this. A lot of it, the time period in the early 1970s, the late 60s, early 1970s, when the women's football really started to kind of get a foothold. people were still under the impression, because there had been literal doctors and psychologists saying that, if women exerted themselves too much, they could, like Brittany mentioned, their uterus could fall out, or if they got hit a certain place, they could get cancer, or that, they couldn't recover if they exerted themselves too much. And the funny part of that is like, women have been giving birth forever. And like, what is more of a physical exertion than childbirth, and all the risks involved with that. And then, so to think that they could perform that, but yet not run a mile around a track, or, play basketball where you could dribble and not just be regulated to half court. It's kind of just mind boggling to think, how just antiquated those thoughts were. And so as women were starting to play more contact sports, I think it just really rubbed up against society's views at that point. And even to this day, there's still some of that lingers, with women, what we see in the WNBA, with women being very physical and getting passionate and angry on the court about a call, or, Serena Williams in tennis, really expressing her anger and really getting passionate and involved in the play. Like, women are still viewed as, oh, they shouldn't be doing that, so there's a lot intertwined into that, but hopefully we answered your initial question.
Well, I think it's wonderful that we can connect many of the issues raised in the book with the whole larger national conversation that women have never been protected from harm in the workplace, in slavery, in communities of color. And to be honest about that, we've subjected women to dangerous conditions in their streets, their neighborhoods, their jobs, harassment, you name it, since the founding of the nation. And so this narrative that it's normal or ordinary for women to be protected from harm, is fairly bogus and easy to disprove. But again, you're correct that the issues raised in the book are about social discomfort with women making their own choices, being fierce on their own terms, in front of an audience. And some of what we get is still the idea that you should look pretty at all times. You can do sports that permit you to do so, and you should avoid activities that make it difficult to look like a fairy princess while in action. So do you think that there's still that kind of directing of young girls? You're nodding your head, Britt.
Yeah, I mean, we can look at sports coverage and see that the majority of women athletes, when they are covered in the media, either they are in these passive, like non-active poses, or, rather than like mid shot or something like that. Like they're less often pictured performing an athletic endeavor, and more often pictured standing with their tennis racket rather than using their tennis racket, or in, sexy poses that cater to this like very cis, this gaze that caters to like cis straight men, this like very specific image. That still exists today, and you can see the discrepancy in how women are covered, when they're covered, how they're covered in the media. And you saw this in the league. I mean, women, unlike in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, who had to play in skirts, these women were allowed to play in full football uniform. Partially, they would not have played in skirts. I think this was a different period, and a lot of these women were openly gay and kind of eschewed gender norms in a lot of different ways. But the marketing, we've talked about the Toledo Troopers a little bit. They are the winningest team in pro football history. They had 5 straight undefeated seasons before they ever lost a game. And they were promoted with an image of 3 women without helmets on with the words "pretty tough" above it. The only woman on that billboard that was actually on the team was Linda Jefferson, and she was their star. And the other 2 were these white women who were paid models. And so it's a very specific kind of image. When you have the best women's football team in the world, who has been designated now by the Pro Football Hall of Fame as the winningest football team of all time, and you can't lead with that when you're promoting their games, you're leading with that they're pretty.
What do you think made the Ohio Troopers so successful?
The Toledo Troopers, I think, were as successful as they were for, a few reasons. I think that they had a coach that was really, really dedicated to seeing them as football players and taking them incredibly seriously. His name was Bill Stout. And they were one of the first teams to pull away from this promoter named Sid Friedman, who had started a bunch of women's football teams around the Rust Belt and was hoping to have a league. And he was very much of the idea that all press is good press, and he'd send hustler photographers to practice to like get under the center. And a Bill Stout, and he asked the Troopers to throw some games because they were making his team look bad because they kept winning. And the Troopers were like, no, we're not going to do that. And they walked away and went independent and formed their own ownership group. Bill Stout did that. And he took his players seriously, and they practiced, I think, like 5 days a week, on top of their full-time jobs. And that narrative was inserted. We are winners. We are a winning team. And so it was the culture of the team. And then some of that is that you have Linda Jefferson on the team, who was the best player in the league. She retired with more touchdowns than O.J. Simpson, like Jim Brown, Walter Payton, like incredible halfback. So she is very, very hard to beat. And then there's a little bit of luck. There's no draft here. Like, you have pro sports now and you spread the talent around and there's salary caps and people get drafted. You're kind of like, who shows up and answers the newspaper ad, right? And so there was that too. And I think the combination of all of those things really made the Troopers who they were.
Future Jeopardy question, who is Linda Jefferson, And in my era, the Toledo Troopers, not the Ohio Troopers. I'm riveted on Ohio. In just about 2 minutes, we're going to go to Q&A, but I wanted to ask, before I forget, if you think one big call to action, one big takeaway that the book offers its readers.
I think for me, it would be to, invest in women's sports and the importance of sharing these stories and keeping this history alive. And when I say invest, I don't just mean monetarily, but it means attending games. It means reading books like this. It means just learning about, the timeline. It means learning about the impact of Title IX, the good and the bad, like that goes along with that. Really, I think we're at a pivotal time where I think women's sports and the attention being paid is now at its greatest height. And I only see that increasing. I just think it's a wonderful time to be involved. And, even if you're not into sports, there's still plenty to take away from, that's not just about the athletic side, but about these women and the incredible things that they have accomplished, not just in the NWFL, but throughout history. There's just a lot of richness there. So that would be my hope that people get from this, to want to read another book and learn more.
And hopefully you'll write another one.
Yeah, who knows?
If there's a call to action, I would say bother the Pro Football Hall of Fame to get the NWFL recognized. Similar to the Women in Baseball exhibit that's in the Cooperstown Baseball Hall of Fame for the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. We would love to see something like that happen for these women. Not just because, as we've only pointed out one direct connection to the NFL here. There are many in this book. There are many that we don't even know about. So the leagues are intertwined, but they also on their own deserve to be recognized for being the first pro women's football league in US history. And I know that's something the players want for themselves as far back as, in the 80s, while the league still existed, at least one player contacted the Hall and offered to send her documents and things, and they turned her down. So, her name is Linda Stamps. She has a lot. She provided us a treasure trove of documents. She played for the Columbus Pacesetters. And, so I would love to see that. So my call to action is if there's some way to start like a petition or like start bothering the Football Hall of Fame to recognize this league, I think that would be probably one of the coolest things that came out of this book.
Okay, you heard it here first, everyone. Activists gear up. Why don't we take some questions? And Lori, can you help me with that?
Absolutely. So I was compiling some questions that I saw audience members raising in the chat. And one of them is a great way to kind of kick off the Q&A, and it's when and how did you decide to focus on this specific topic?
So Lyndsey and I were actually originally working on a book that was much larger in scope, looking at the women in football history, kind of on the field, off the field, coaching, cheerleading, sidelines, refereeing, you know, all of it. And it didn't sell. It was too broad. There was not a narrative arc, we were told. But while we were researching that, we discovered the NWFL. And I was the sports columnist for Long Reads at the time. And I decided to recreate the Toledo Troopers' first loss. I asked the question of what happens when the winningest team in history loses its first game. And I was like, wow, there's nothing here. And I tracked some players down and was surprised at how vividly they remembered that game on both sides of the ball. It was really incredible. It was an overtime. It was an overtime loss to a flea flicker play. Like, everyone remembered this, and it was really incredible. And as I was doing that, I kept coming back to Lyndsey and was like, Lyndsey, who did these teams play? There must have been other teams in the league. Like, what is this? And I think we knew pretty quickly that this was the story, and we pivoted. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. And then there was a follow-up question to this from one of our viewers. It says, my impression is that many men really like to watch football and go to football games. Do women come in meaningful numbers to women's games? Do men?
Was it present? Are we talking present time?
Present.
Watching women's football? I'm sorry.
Mhm. Yes, watching women's football.
It says big women come in meaningful numbers to these women's games. So I think that's the NWFL.
Okay. I mean, fans in general, I mean, the curiosity and novelty definitely drew people in. And I think men maybe in particular were kind of more like, what's this about kind of a thing, if they weren't family or friends of the women playing. But meaningful numbers is an interesting way to put the attendance of the NWFL, because they didn't attract, that was part of ultimately what did the league in, is just lack of consistent attendance and growing fan base.
But I will say what people don't realize is that the trajectory of a league, you have to compare, like the NFL didn't have tens of thousands of fans in the stands either. If you actually look at the NFL and its original years, it actually is pretty much on par with the NWFL. So if given the same resources and investment, it could have had the same trajectory. But the other thing that I think is about more than half of the NFL's viewers are women, I believe. Isn't that right, Lyndsey?
I think it's like 52% now.
So actually the majority of people who consider themselves fans of the NFL are actually women.
That is
But I would add
interesting.
that it's very important that we have women supporting women's sports, because in the university setting, too often I've seen that women's games are poorly attended, not just by women, but by women's studies faculty. And I make it a point to have my behind in the bleachers in those events, but I do think we can do better. And I do think we need to make it more of a practice to have date night, however defined, include attendance at a women's game. Small town, college, whatever.
Yeah, I attend Boston Renegades games. They're the local, they're the modern day equivalent of the Toledo Troopers. They're currently the best women's football team in the country, and I'm lucky enough to be local to them. They're lucky if they get a few hundred people to games, and these are the best women's football players in the world. So it's definitely still an issue.
Some of my fondest memories in college actually were my dad had season tickets to the Lady Balls. I went to the University of Tennessee, and when Pat had Summit was coaching, and we had father-daughter date nights, if you want to call it that, but Dad would drive down to Knoxville and we would attend the Lady Balls basketball games together, and best memories there. One other question to clarify, what is the time span that the book covers?
Well, it covers the league from 1974 to 1988, and then we talk about the legacy of the league up until current present day time, and then also there's history from the time football was invented. I believe it was like the late 1800s, but up through the early 1900s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and how women were trying to play or get involved in some aspect. And then the 1960s, when women's football was really starting to take hold. So we cover a lot of ground, not just the league's duration.
You were saying before the program, of course, today is Super Bowl Sunday. The NFL's season technically ends today or after the Super Bowl game, but NWFL or Women's League starts April.
Yeah, women's football season is April through July. And actually, I believe the Women's Football Alliance, which is the league that the Boston Renegades, who I just mentioned, they play in, I believe they got a deal with ESPN2. So there may actually be games streaming nationally as opposed to streaming on Facebook Live, which is where you would have had to watch them previously. Mm-hmm.
If you think in terms of that we have the Olympics followed by March Madness, followed by the Title IX 50th anniversary, which corresponds also to the Women's Football League season. We should have the media focusing on these issues of women in the spotlight, their history and their future for a good 6 months. And within that, there's ample room to pressure for better coverage, better awareness, and Hall of Fame.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And we also know that the NFL right now is come under fire for some of its DEIA policies. And we have a question from one of our audience members about diversity. Were the leagues of the 70s diverse? Is women's football today diverse?
Well, the league we focused on, and the only one that existed at that time, was the National Women's Football League. And yeah, I'd say it was diverse, and not just in regards to race, but also in sexuality. You know, women, gay and straight, played together, of different races played together, uniting, doing something that they just love to do, and that society told them they shouldn't be doing. And also a lot of the players came from working class backgrounds that they had in common. And you know, it was a progressive league. There were Black coaches who weren't able to get jobs in the NFL, who ended up coaching in this league instead. So in that regard, it was ahead of its time. As far as the leagues today, I'd say the same thing. I'd say women's leagues, and I think Brittany would agree with me on this, have always been progressive and sort of ahead of the time, and of, more inclusion than their male counterparts.
They have to be, because they're already going against the status quo and fighting power, just stepping on the field. Like, they're already doing something that they are told that they shouldn't do just by playing sports. And so I think that's why we see culturally that women's leagues, we can look at the WNBA and how progressive they are. They're the first pro league to, partner with Planned Parenthood. Meanwhile, you have, MLB teams partnering with crisis pregnancy centers. You see the difference there. And I think that the reason, and there's so many more openly gay athletes in women's leagues as well. And I think just a lot of that is, and because they've had to be fighting systems just, to play. That's why they've been on the forefront. Women's leagues have also been on the forefront of the racial justice issues. They came first, and then the men followed them there. Yeah.
That's really well said. Bonnie, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I think that one of the nice things is we're also seeing more diversity in women's sports journalism, and that it's been a difficult thing to break into being a sports writer for newspapers if you're a woman, more so if you're a woman of color, and that we're getting some better representation in terms of writing, anchoring, commentary. The proliferation of different sports channels helps, but I've been really impressed with what's been going on with some of the different vehicles like Athleta and ESPNW, and I hope that people being introduced to you today will consider encouraging a young friend to think of sports journalism. And the more we have women writing about women's history, and beyond, the better we'll have books coming out year round to fill in these gaps.
And on that note, we just have a couple minutes here left, but on that note, the three of you were like popcorn before the program, coming out with these new titles emerging scholarship on this topic that everyone should take some time to investigate. Can you spew some of those titles out for our audience?
37 Words by Sherry Boshert about Title IX, No Stopping Us Now, Lucy Jane Bledsoe, young adult novel about the struggle for Title IX compliance in the early 70s. I have a book coming out called What's the Score? 25 Years of Teaching Women's Sports History. So we have a genre, and it's a really rich one. There is much, much more. And I actually have a women's sports bibliography that I'd be happy to send to interested folks.
And I will say, Dr. Katie J. Taylor is writing a book on the era before the NWFL. I don't know the title of that book yet, but it is coming out, I think, next year. And it covers, the period right up to when the NWFL started. So it will fill in, much more, flesh out much more than our book does that time period. So I'm really excited about that.
She's based in the UK, right?
I think so.
Same one. Okay. Okay. Any last thoughts before I give my closing spiel here?
What a pleasure to read this book. I have it, filled with little Post-its. Again, everybody read page 4, everybody read page 222, and then go back and start over. But happy to have it on my shelf and delighted to have had the honor to moderate today.
Thank you to all three of you for being here. I appreciate your time. Thank you for lending us your talents. And thank you to our audience as well for joining us here today. Just a reminder that the program was recorded and will be available on our website later this week. If you enjoyed this Sundays at Home presentation, then please join us again on Sunday, February 20th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when NWHM Pre-Doctoral Fellow in Women's History, Mariana Bramman, will lead audiences through a virtual tour of the museum's popular online exhibit, Game Changers, Women and Sports. For a full listing of upcoming programs and for registration information, please visit the Sundays at Home landing page under the Public Programs tab at www.womenshistory.org. As always, all events are free, but advanced registration is required. And until next time we meet, please stay safe and healthy, and happy Super Bowl Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you.